Good morning, afternoon. My name is Daniel Serwer. I'm the director of the Conflict Management Program here at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and it's a particular pleasure for me to convene this discussion of Russian influence in the Balkans, methods and results. It's intentionally an analytical title, but it's not a balanced panel, as you can see. It's not a panel that is indifferent to Russian influence in the Balkans. I nevertheless hope we can be careful and analytical about the current situation, which I think has deteriorated significantly with respect to Russian influence in recent years. That said, I can't help but mention in opening this panel that today the EU announced a new enlargement strategy which opens the door to whoever is ready to come in. They have said that Serbia and Montenegro are in the lead, but that's simply an objective fact since they've opened Montenegro in particular has opened quite a few chapters of the acquis. But they've made it absolutely clear, I think, that this is still a regatta and that everybody qualifies for EU membership on his own bottom. That is, you get across the finish line because you qualified. There's no preordained order of things. I think it's quite extraordinary that the EU has opened the door at this point. It's not easy for them. For 10 years, we've seen financial crisis, recession, migrant crisis, and many other reasons why it became politically very difficult for the EU, but the business cycle is looking up, and Mr. Hahn has taken advantage of the situation to open the window again, and I think that's a great thing. We're going to proceed very quickly through the panel in an effort to get to questions by 1:30. And we'll proceed in the order in which people are seated. First, Jelena Milic, who is the director of the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies in Belgrade. Siniša Vukovic, who is our Pride of Montenegro professor here at SAIS. Steve Rukavina, who's president of the National Federation of Croatian Americans, who tells me his name is properly pronounced Rukavina, so I'll mention that. Meto Kolosky, who's president of the United Macedonian Diaspora. And then, with particular thanks, Rauf Bajrović. At the end, the idea of this panel was Rauf's, so we have to give credit.
Too kind.
Credit where credit is due. Jelena, you can talk either from your seat or from here, wherever you're more comfortable.
Oh. Thank you, Dan. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here again. Actually, almost 8 years ago, this very center, and thanks to Mr. Dan Server, the book was published called International Community and Western Balkans, Unfinished Business, if you remember. And I was one of the contributors, and surprise, surprise, then I was writing about uncompleted Serbian security sector reform as the problem that is impeding the consolidation of democracy and stabilization not only in Serbia but in the entire region. And unfortunately, I'm not going to change a lot what I have to say. Mr. Dan Server rightly pointed out the importance of the new EU strategy for the Western Balkans. Unfortunately, although it has mechanisms, the EU is, again, not mentioning the state of affairs and the security sectors throughout the region, although not all of the countries are on their path towards the NATO, and you can't expect NATO to handle this issue for everyone. I'm very pleased to be here because I think the timing for this event and the topic of this event are excellent. I'm proud to say that my center's report or our findings have been quoted 6 times in an excellent report published recently, promoted by Senator Ben Cardin and his team, the Democrats in the U.S. Senate. I think that this report really is, if I may say so, even more comprehensive and significant than House of Lords report on Western Balkans. Having said all of that, let me start with the following about the Russian influence in the entire region, and then in more details about key avenues of Russian influence and how it affects Serbia and again the entire region. The attention of the Western international community on Russian influence in the Western Balkans somehow overlapped, misfortunately, with their understanding of the scope of their disinformation, hybrid operation throughout the liberal Western world, and their meddling in democratic electoral processes in the liberal democratic world. But in the Western Balkans, it predates all of that. It has never actually disappeared. We can't talk about traditionally good historical relationship because there are no traditionally good, but the Russian influence is present, and it never succeeded to exist even after October the 5th democratic transition from authoritarian to regime to democracy in Serbia. So when Vučić and Nikolić, the current rulers of Serbia, don't forget, Nikolić is not retired Serbian president. He is an active official of the Serbian government in charge for parallel Ministry of Foreign Affairs called the Committee for Cooperation with Russia and with China. When they came to power, Petrašev and Shoigu, at the time Minister of Defense of Russia, came immediately to Serbia like a week after the election of the Serbian Progressive Party, and they said the existing level of cooperation in the security sector between Serbia and Russia has been shamefully low since Milosevic was toppled and, Đinđić took the power, and it has to be changed. And this is exactly what has been happening in Serbia ever since. So yes, there is, of course, an increased influence in soft power. The Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies wrote about it extensively, but let's not forget that the key channel of influence is still actually in the security sector and in the energy, which is related, and I will explain how. So that was, I think, my first point that I would like to highlight. I will now mention for the whole region 3 pre-existing conditions which I think are key avenues of Russian influence, and they precede Trump, Brexit, and refugee crisis, and even the invention of so-called stabilocracy as a key problem currently in the region. I think that those 3 issues that we have extensively written about in our report, Basic Instinct, supported by National Endowment for Democracy, one of our key partners in our endeavors, are the ones actually through which the Russian influence articulates itself predominantly. So these are uncompleted process of transitional justice, first and foremost, uncompleted trials for war crimes. Then, uncompleted security sector reform. Even unaddressed, the security sector reform has never been prioritized by any Western entity dealing in the region, be it government, be it NATO, be it EU, or even the big donors from the donors community, unfortunately. So if you opt to go from the authoritarian regime, but in Serbian case and in case of many countries of Western Balkan, more importantly, from war and war crimes burden regime towards democracy and progress in a peaceful manner, you actually don't have legal mechanisms to purge your security system from the perpetrators of the war crimes, not only of, from those who have been oppressing human rights, like in case of Eastern Europe. The only legal mechanism that you actually have is the set of obligations that you have towards the Western international community with regard to cooperation and trial for the war crimes. So you can't separate the need for justice for the victims and their families and everybody in one hand, and the fact that you have the compromised security sector and that these tries are actually the only mechanism to purge the security sector. The third underlining a situation in all countries of the region that significantly have been contributing to slow process of consolidation of stability and process towards the EU that Russians are now heavily exploiting is the fact that most countries of the region have constitutional arrangements imposed sometimes out of sheer necessity, but nevertheless, that are actually politicizing ethnicities to a level that you are forced to be just an ethnic Serb, ethnic Bosniak, ethnic Muslim, ethnic Kosovar, ethnic Albanian, you name it. It's impossible to be liberal, to be progressive in such institutional settings. It was sometimes out of necessity, sometimes it was opportunistic, but nevertheless, it is heavily exploited by Russians these days. I will give you just the latest example. Montenegro is case in point. Most of you know for Montenegro due to the coup d'etat attempt, which happened in fall 2016. And by the way, this case is just becoming stronger. The key witnesses in this process have just a few days ago confirmed the findings of the indictment and made, very compelling case and proved links between Russian intelligence community officials and weaponry, and the fact that the Democratic Front, the political party, the cronies of Putin in Montenegro actually knew about it and that they should be held as perpetrators as well. So in Montenegro, the legislation related to citizenship is slightly rigid because Montenegro is a small state, so ethnic engineering would be possible if this legislation is more liberal. And the Serbs in Montenegro can be seen as diaspora. They are Serbs from Montenegro. So they are actually now under the Russian influence trying to Daytonize Montenegro and to repeal their current progressive constitution, which stipulates that all citizens of Montenegro are those who comprise constituency, that Montenegro is state of all its citizens. They want to be like in Bosnia, one out of two nations that are actually having sovereignty over the Montenegro state. But Russians are seeing that as a too far-fetching and slow process, and they push Serbs in Montenegro to register themselves as an ethnic minority, because by doing so, they can use this ethnic minority position and alleged oppression like they did in Macedonia until recently to claim that why they have to have direct access and why they have a right to directly intervene based on brotherhood, Slavic Orthodox brotherhood. So this is just one example. You wouldn't expect that in Montenegro that way, but the same was a case in Macedonia, in which we have a very small, for example, Serbian community, but nevertheless we identified the rise of number of Serbian-based, alleged Serbian-based political parties in Macedonia, which then have been received on a very high level in Moscow, etc., etc. Or to mention Srpska lista, the reserved seats for the ethnic Serbs in Kosovo, which was again part of the Ahtisaari plan, but pretty misfortunately, I think, designed. Until recently, it has been a tool for direct influence of Serbian government into Kosovo, and maybe the Western international community was abusing it for its own goals sometimes. But now, more and more, we see the key handler of Putin for the region, Mr. Sergej Železniak, is addressing Srpska lista directly and demanding from them to do this and that, surpassing totally government in Belgrade. So the key problem in Serbia is the fact that, of course, the Russians have majority of our energy sector, but everybody knows about it. More importantly is that Gazprom and Naftogaz actually are seen just as a foreign company, regardless whether they are state-owned or privately owned company, and they have a right to their own policy with regard to their corporate security structures. And what the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies has recently identified, and I hope we shall have a chance to explore it further on, is that they are actually building up unproportionally big structure of the private security within these Gazprom and Serbia gas companies, and that they are mostly actually recruiting top-notch Milosevic time guys who were either parts of the military or state security agency, or from the Serbian police or army from the time when they have been committing all these crimes in the region. This is really bad news, in combination with the fact that chief of Serbian army, the existing chief of the Serbian army, General Dikovic, is heavily compromised with the war crimes that his units at least committed during 98-94 war in Kosovo. So Russians are actually building up a homegrown little green man in the Serbian structures, not only in Gazprom and Serbia Gas, but also in regular security structures, by undermining the significance of continuation of trials for war crimes, and by undermining already confirmed second instance verdicts of the ICTY and the ICTY legacy as such. So why should anybody, and there are a lot of them, in the Serbian security structures support EU progress towards the EU, when at least in paper, from the Stabilization and Association Agreement onwards, stipulate that there is an obligation to go on with these trials, when they can easily assume that the long head of justice will finally reach them. So they are not going to say that publicly and openly, but they will always use this excuse, alleged need for some kind of support of Russia based on our organic identities and links that goes beyond what Russia does at this particular moment. Nobody has an attitude about it in Serbia, and this is the problem. So this is where I would stop right now. I would just like to finish with the following. Serbia is in the process of adopting new strategic and doctrinary documents in the field of security and in defense. From whatever we have completed so far in our analysis and research, again supported by National Endowment for Democracy, tells us that nothing progressive and substantial is going to happen, unfortunately, that Serbia is actually just formally paying a lip service to the EU integration, but it is not going to see Kosovo just as a challenge, not a threat, as it is at the moment in our national security strategy. So Kosovo is going to remain the key national security threat, despite the Brussels Agreement on Normalization of Relationship. So that there is no going to be improvement in the democratic oversight of the security sector, on the contrary. And the focus is going to be on privatization of our defense industry. And there is an ongoing project, I think, supported by some in Russia or from Russia through the alleged trade unions, that majority of the shares should be given. If they have to be privatized, then they have at least to end up in Russian hands. This is what they are plotting at the moment as we speak. Unfortunately, in Serbia, the problem is that despite government open door policy towards Russian influence, this is something which is significantly different from other countries in the Western Europe and in most countries in the region, I would say. Our officials are conducting open door policy for Russian influence. But the problem is that those structures that call themselves democratic opposition to President/Prime Minister Vučić would actually subscribe tomorrow to most of his policies, partition of Kosovo included. And we heard just this moment, I mean, it is not a coincidence, in a huge event organized by Serbian Minister of Defense in the same time, literally, when Johannes Hahn and Federica Mogherini were presenting the new EU strategy for Western Balkans. Actually, that issue of Kosovo can be resolved without general issue of Serbian national question. He is building up the fake case of build-up of the Greater Albania as a justification for now totally out an open policy of building up Greater Serbia with partition of Kosovo and with chop shop of part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Again, this government would not have such a maneuver, and Russians wouldn't have such a maneuver in Serbia if the so-called democratic opposition is not so opportunistically silent and without attitude about what's going on. They were bragging about the fact that they were present at the National Democratic Convention during the election period, but they are not commenting, for example, Senator Ben Cardin report. Same, unfortunately, goes for most of so-called free media who are claiming to be oppressed by Vučić. I doubt so. And for two opportunistic and technocratic NGOs, allegedly of the pro-EU orientation. They have no attitude of the weaknesses and cracks in liberal democracies and how Russians are exploiting them, not to non-democratic only interests, but also hostile and malignant, like they say. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Jelena. Sinisha, Jelena's painted a pretty grim picture.
Hey, well,
I'm hoping you will lighten it with Montenegro.
I cannot promise that, and because we all know what happened in Montenegro. And
No, unfortunately not.
what-
Everyone, you think that we...
At least on the superficial level, we know the highlights. And since Jelena borrowed from Montenegrin example, especially when it comes to minority issues, I'll borrow from Serbia something as well. And I'll start by a quote from a well-known Serbian historian from nationalistic circles, Milorad Dekmečić, who in one of his studies on the sources of the First
My
World
neighbor,
War,
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Sarajevo, yes.
In one of his studies, he actually exclaimed, in the studies of the First World War, that Russia uses the Balkans to prove itself as a great power. And this is a mantra that keeps repeating itself in the Balkans. And if we dissect this statement, we can see it that even in the most nationalistic circles in the Balkans, Russia has still not achieved a role of a hegemonic power. That's one. And it's a perpetual contender in achieving a status of a great power. It needs to prove itself continuously that it's relevant, not only in the eyes of the other contenders, but also in the eyes of the local communities in the Balkans. Now, when it comes to Montenegro, Montenegro is anecdotally the least relevant of all former republics in Yugoslavia. And one of the reasons is because it never had an armed conflict on its own territory. So it was never in the news. And at the same time, it was so small that it was unable to influence any of the regional dynamics during the violent dissolution of the country. So as such, it may serve as a useful test case for Russian influence in the Balkans. Now, the long story short, it regained independence in 2006, and if you go back in time and look at how Montenegro was portrayed by Western media back then, it was portrayed like a Russian fiefdom. Massive influx of Russian capital came to Montenegro, especially when it comes to heavy industries and real estate. And as such, there was a strong suspicion and disbelief about the Euro-Atlantic agenda of the official Montenegrin authorities at that time. Now, as time went by, Montenegrin credence to the Euro-Atlantic agenda became strong, and especially consolidated during the Ukrainian crisis when Montenegro joined EU sanctions towards Russia, and it did not back off from its NATO path, even in the light of very strong Russian opposition, especially when it was saying that it views Montenegrin accession as a provocation. So I think we all know that everything culminated in 2016 elections, October 2016 elections, which Western media have been reporting on. So this is how many people know Montenegro right now. So it's no longer a Russian fiefdom, now it's a Russian prey. Montenegro is not the only one that has been experiencing this type of Russian interference, or let's put it this way, this type of clandestine interference, so not very open. And we are trying here to unpack the extent of this interference. But it is a prime example of how far it can go, because it's the only case where the end game was a regime change. Something that, at least on a public level, authorities in Moscow vocally object to in any other situation around the world. And in Montenegro, they use the circumstances in order to achieve the end game that they don't want to see anywhere else, especially not at their home. So now, needless to say, Moscow's authorities are denying any type of involvement and rejecting any type of association with the events. And there is an ongoing judicial process that will unveil how far this influence and how far this involvement has really been. Montenegrin authorities have been very careful not to associate these events with high-level Russian authorities in Kremlin. In fact, the official label of those ones that were conducting these activities are Russian nationalists and nationalistic circles. So it's not really Kremlin per se, but it's let's call it the second tier around Kremlin. Those ones that have maybe less influence when it comes to high-ranking decision-making processes, but nevertheless, maybe they use Montenegro. We can speculate on that, using Montenegro to prove their worth to the higher ranks in Kremlin. Now, I don't want to go into details about the events, but the premise for my talk is very simple. I'm going to borrow from a recent article from Foreign Affairs who has defined a new type of power, looking at China and Russia's dealings with the rest of the international community, and they labeled it as sharp power. Now, sharp power is somewhere in between soft and hard power, the usual suspects that we already know. The idea behind sharp power is the use of information for deceptive purposes. It is, I'm going to read out, it includes initiatives in the spheres of media, culture, think tanks, academia, and not to broaden the debate or to create alternative ideas, but to actually dilute the debate and increase confusion about the actual core values of liberal democracies. So if consolidated Western democracies are still coping with this type of interference, you can only imagine how difficult it is for still not consolidated democratic systems such as the ones we have in the Balkans. Now, looking from a macro level, and you look at Montenegro, you may see a success story. It averted foreign interference in the elections in 2006. Stability and security were preserved. Montenegro joined NATO eventually, and then at the same time, it is a front runner, as Dan Server said, in the upcoming, or let's say, hopefully upcoming EU enlargement in 2025. Now, on surface, everything seems to be moving according to the Euro-Atlantic agenda, but if you scratch that surface, you will see that Montenegro really is still subject to this type of sharp power coming from Russia, because this is now the topic of the day. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on the influence it exercises on the political level, media level, civil society level, and on the religious level. These four elements are crucial to understand the extent to which it influences. Now, please remember that I'm not talking about economy anymore, because all of those previous types of economic involvements of Russian-backed capital has gone sour. And interestingly enough, Moscow's appeals, official appeals not to travel to Montenegro, because it is unsafe, it is anti-Russian, etc., did not yield any success among Russian tourists. And in fact, there has not been a decrease, but on the contrary, over the past 2 years when it comes to Montenegrin tourism. Long story short, in Montenegro, we have the strongest opposition party bloc called the Democratic Front, who are openly pro-Russian. And their leaders are now charged in the process as co-conspirators of the attempted terrorist attack. That's the official label, not the coup d'etat or the regime change, but the attempted terrorist attack. Now, as I said, we will see how far it goes, but their association with Russian parties was never secret. They would pay frequent visits to Moscow. They would endorse platforms that were drafted in Moscow about a collective neutrality pact between Balkan states before Montenegro joined NATO. And right now they have a support by some marginal parties from Duma who have paid them visits in Montenegro because they cannot travel. Their passports have been revoked by the authorities. Other parties, even those ones that were pro-Western, are still very officially ambivalent about the Russian interference in the events of the elections of 2016. And we can talk about the reasons behind that. What is interesting is that from former civil society movements pro-neutrality, new parties are emerging that have, again, a very strong pro-Russian creed. They are getting a lot of space in the media, and which is also very interesting, they're not getting space in the official Russian-backed media outlets, but in those consolidated mainstream media which give them legitimacy and credence among the wider audience. As such, they're legitimized, they are advertised, and they have more visibility among the population in Montenegro. Now, when it comes to media, you have to understand that not only in Montenegro is very small, even compared to the Balkan standards, but in the Balkans in general, big news agencies are, let's say, dying or perishing. So media outlets in the Balkans are borrowing pre-packed news from those ones willing to serve them the news. And Associated Press and the likes do not care about the Balkans as much. So the media do not have enough to borrow from the West, and they're borrowing pre-packed news from the East. And let me just read you the headlines of some of the mainstream media in Montenegro, and you will understand how far it goes. The headlines read, look into Putin's school scorecard. See if he scored highest grades in math or history. There is no traffic jam for Putin. Putin taking photos with female soldiers. Putin's daughter getting divorced. Putin giving a hug to a factory worker, etc., etc., etc. So,
Sinisha, I have to urge you.
I'm ending. So if you see this, you will understand that it's humanizing and diluting the debate. It's showing that there is, to just borrow from a very well-known connoisseur of Russian media sphere, nothing is true, everything is possible. And if there is no truth, there is much to be debated about. And this confusion just adds to the chaos that exists in the Balkans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinisha. Steve,
Oh, okay.
did I do that wrong? I set
Yes,
you up
yes,
wrong.
yes, I was number 3. That's right. That's right. I was fascinated by what's going on in
I set up the seating
Montenegro.
wrong.
That's right. Thank you, Daniel, and it's an honor to be here today. First, let me say that Croatia entering NATO in 2009 and the European Union in 2013 is geopolitically very significant, and you'll hear from me over the next few minutes how the membership in these Euro-Atlantic entities and with Croatia's current leaders really looking west as Euro-Atlantic globalists has drastically minimized Russian influences in Croatia. Both President Grabar Kitarovic and Prime Minister Andrej Plenković are committed to these two Euro-Atlantic entities and are two of the more moderate HDZ members of a very conservative party. I do intend to share some details and anecdotes about substantive developments, mostly from the last year, that demonstrate Croatia's commitment to being a role model in Southeastern Europe from a Euro-Atlantic perspective. My thesis here today is that there's 6 major mechanisms that Russia employs to magnify their economic and political influence in any country. You've probably heard many of them: leveraging economic vulnerabilities, usually energy, exploiting governance details, capturing influential policymakers, leveraging corporate profits, pulling the old-time security networks via espionage into play, and the corporate raiding and takeover strategies through shared assets. Let's first look at Croatia's trading relationship with Russia and the fact that Russian imports are less than 2% of Croatia's overall GDP, and is one of several key elements that show little Croatian dependence on Russia from an economic perspective, and why there's less success with the use of soft power via economic tactics by Russia in Croatia. So Russia at less than 2% is number 17 as a trading partner with Croatia. Compare that to Germany, which is number 1, 16%. And 3.3 billion. Even countries like Belgium, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia have more import dollars into Croatia. Also, Russia has not been able to cultivate and exploit relationships in significant partnerships politically with nationalist parties, populists or Eurosceptic types that we've seen in some countries in Central Europe. Of course, there are several corruptible parliament politicians have caved in to Russian influences and money. I can share a few examples. One was through a job with a Russian-controlled energy company. Another one was a Sabor member who had a one-man consulting firm, and the Russians bought it for close to like $1 million US, and he's still in the parliament. Let's take a look at some overt and covert strategies in Croatia. Most have been, quite frankly, not that fruitful. But that does not mean that the Russians have not tried to flex some of their economic leverage. For example, Croatia's biggest company, Agricor, 15% of Croatia's GDP collapsed last March. And by April, the Russian state-owned savings bank made a major move to purchase and finance the larger share of debt in a takeover. However, Croatia chose to create a state-run administration and establish financial liquidity to stabilize the company and to establish, or better put, to stop any possible Russian bank from acquiring a majority ownership of Croatia's biggest company. Next, let's look at the energy sphere in Croatia involving Russian companies. There are some signs that Russia is losing some steam and focus with energy projects in southeastern Europe. First, some data and detail that only 35% of Croatia's natural gas comes from Russian-controlled or owned Prvo Plinarsko Društvo, based in Vukovar, which is the Gazprom arm in Croatia. Croatia just signed in September a 10-year contract with Gazprom for 1 billion cubic meters of gas per year. Croatia does produce 40% of its own energy, and so the more effective Russian punish and reward tactics are not as evident in Croatia. Let me note that the Russian Lukoil company is pulling out of Croatia, and that's another sign of waning Russian interest in Croatia. Next, Rosneft, the 75% Russian government-owned company, has been trying to buy the Hungarian MOL shares within Croatia's INA, the national oil company ownership. Rosneft, as most of you know, is the leading extraction refinement company from a Russian perspective, with 176 billion in sales in 2016. And they're pushing the concept to the Croatian government that they would shoulder the cost to modernize INA. But I'm here today to say the Croatian government is not really buying that line and are not moving towards any collaboration with the Russian company regarding any of INA's shares. As many of you know, there's a lot of EU and US political and economic support for Croatia's proposed floating LNG terminal project off the island of Kirk, and again with the goal to minimize dependence on Russian energy. The LNG terminal could support the movement of natural gas in a north-south corridor within Eastern and Central Europe countries. There was an EU-sponsored meeting in Zagreb last Tuesday, and yes, you Ambassador Bob Kohorst was there to show more American support. The EU has extended 102 million euros to Croatia for this LNG project. The question does loom, why U.S. LNG companies are not stepping up in this open season with the clock ticking to make binding commitments to help the booking capacity for Croatia's terminal, and there's a late April deadline. As a sign of U.S. support, 2 State Department officials will be in Zagreb over the next 5 weeks. Seuss and Ario, the Amos Hochstein replacement, will be there on February 12th, and William Litchfield from the State Department's Energy and Natural Resources Division will be there in Zagreb on March 7th. Now let me bring a company called Gasfin into our discussions about the Kirk LNG project. This company, with a Slovenian CEO with very strong Russian ties, has their own LNG plans. It has been reported in the Croatian press that Gasfin has financed the anti-floating terminal study that is being used by a local Croatian environmental group to oppose the floating LNG terminal next to Kirk. Next, Gasfin, even with a lower bid than others, somehow last year, won the HIDA, Austrian government agency's bid to acquire mortgage papers left over from bad debts, to acquire the ideal Dioki plot of land on the island of Kirk. So Gasfin is all in for a land-based terminal and are publicly opposing the EU, US, Croatia floating terminal LNG project, which just happens to be the Russian position. Croatia's pipeline company, Plincaro, is also very involved and connected to this LNG project from booking commitments and from another energy goal to improve connectivity with nearby markets, looking to build a reverse flow function on a pipeline that brings gas from Hungary to Croatia. I'm talking to MOL about that. Okay, I must admit there's been one example of a major energy Russian affiliated company's success on the shores of the Republic of Croatia. The Adriatic tank at the Place port is owned by VTTI, part of the Vital Group, and Energy Naturalis holding company. And both companies have strong Russian connections. Also, ENNA, separate from INA, is a subsidiary of PPD, the Gazprom arm in Croatia. So thus the Place port and the Russian-affiliated companies controlling the Adriatic tank terminal, not too far from Neum, control the flow of LPG and clean petroleum products into southeastern Europe, especially the petroleum products going into Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a strategic win for these affiliated companies with Russian ties, and the Chinese are involved there too, and that's another 10-minute presentation. I want to mention that Croatian President Grabar Kitarović has been the driving force for pushing a north-south infrastructure from the Adriatic Sea to the Baltic Sea to Black Sea approach to, again, minimize reliance on Russian energy. Croatia's Madam President, with the Three Seas initiative held in Warsaw last summer, was able to bring a large American delegation with President Trump and many other ministers to attend this meeting of 12 EU countries on the matters of mostly energy and telecommunications. Russia was not there in Warsaw. It's an interesting fact that Croatia has not even had an ambassador for Moscow for 2 years until late last year. It was a typical Kremlin playbook tactic last summer when the Russian ambassador, after the Croatian government had shown some support for the Ukraine, announced and went public to say that the Croatian president's trip to Moscow in a few months with 130 Croatian business persons, could be canceled if the strong support of the Ukraine continued. Now, the trip did take place, and the primary goal was to help Croatian companies export to Russia. 2 months later, in December 2017, the Russian ambassador Anvar Azimov went public and was asking for Croatia's decision about some new major energy projects that were being pushed in Moscow when the Croatian president visited there, and evidently the Russians were pushing for the construction of new power plants. So in closing, I hope my fastly read presentation was illuminating on how Croatia, as a NATO and EU member, is geopolitically a close ally of the United States and very much a contributing member of the Euro-Atlantic community.
Thank you, Steve. Beto.
Thank you, Dan, and SAIS for organizing this timely discussion, and I'm really pleased that the diaspora voice is on the table because it's an important voice, I think, for the entire region. It's really a pleasure to sit on this distinguished panel with a lot of friends and allies long-term of Macedonia, and our efforts to join Euro-Atlantic institutions. I represent, it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the United Macedonian Diaspora, representing the interests and needs of the Macedonian American community. I want to clarify here that we are no representation of any political party in Macedonia or the state, and fortunately with no funding from any government in Macedonia or here, all that, we're fully funded by the diaspora community. And I want to highlight a few facts here on this relationship and the narrative that's being played in Macedonia and around the world on the Russian friendship of Macedonia. The Macedonian diaspora, by the way, amounts to about 18 to 21% of annual GDP in Macedonia in remittances. Those are public transfers, and then who knows how many millions of dollars are through other vehicles. And so the diaspora definitely plays a critical role in the growth of Macedonia. And so we're glad to be part of helping the state of Macedonia. I want to go back a little bit in history because this narrative, and I have to say the failings of the consistent U.S.-EU policy on Macedonia's NATO EU membership have brought Russia a lot more engaged and involved in Macedonia than they have ever been before. Just some facts. Macedonia actually historically has been tied more with Ukraine. We actually have a Ukrainian minority spanning about a century and a lot of business ties. And a majority of frescoes and iconography in Macedonia are brought in from Ukraine to be drawn in Macedonia. And so historically, religiously, economically, we're a lot more tied with the Ukrainian people than the Russian people. Russia has never been on the side of Macedonia historically. In 1878, the Russians imposed the Treaty of San Stefano on the Ottomans, and as a result created the new Bulgarian Principality, including most of geographic Macedonia and what is today the Republic of Macedonia. The British and Austro-Hungarian empires saw this as a threat and that Bulgaria would become a Russian satellite, which is not far from the truth. 4 months later, Macedonia was given back to the Ottomans under the Treaty of Berlin, which, by the way, was not favorable to Bosnia and Herzegovina and failed to recognize the aspirations of the people in the Balkans in their right of self-determination. The Macedonian Independence movement, which goes back to the 1800s, but really didn't see fruition until the 1900s, there were efforts by international powers to create a principality out of Macedonia as well, but they failed. The Macedonian intelligentsia, or the diaspora, largely based in Geneva, Sofia, and St. Petersburg, were really never able to garner enough support from the West or from Russia for their independence movement. In 1912, Russia, which has been seen as the protector of the so-called Slav nationalism, supported the Balkan League, composed of Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia, to drive the Turks out of Macedonia. However, this league fell apart because these three countries fought against each other to divide the spoils, which occurred in 1913 with the Treaty of Bucharest. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because, and you'll note a little bit later, that there is a narrative in Macedonia that Russia has stood on the side of Macedonia historically. The Balkan Wars, as they were known, saw hundreds of thousands of Macedonians killed and countless villages and towns burned to the ground, all in an effort to put a stamp on the Macedonian national movement. What then began was what I call a cultural genocide of the Macedonian people by the governments of then Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia, largely supported by Soviet Russia. It was not until 1944, when the first state of Macedonia was founded and incorporated under then Yugoslavia, that Macedonians in what is today Republic of Macedonia managed to see some liberalization on their heritage and a revival. But do not confuse this with Macedonians being overly joyous for being under communist Yugoslavia and never stopped fighting for greater rights of Macedonians within Yugoslavia and the surrounding neighboring countries. An interesting fact that some in Macedonia like to tell, including President Georgi Ivanov recently on a trip to Moscow, that Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's apprentice and successor, which was Soviet Union leader from 1953 to 1955, was of Macedonian heritage, whose grandparents moved to Russia from Ohrid. And I see in our audience one of our former representatives in St. Petersburg, who now lives here. And Macedonia does have a minority community in Russia who discovered this fact in his research in Moscow. And so nobody really knew about this up until recently, or when President Ivanov started bringing up these facts. And I will say that Malenkov never really did anything to support Macedonia's independence movement. And so all of this narrative building that, yes, we had one of our own as a leader of the Soviet Union. So this is false. And keep in mind that Tito was non-aligned with Russian, his non-alignment policy with Russia. Now let's fast forward to 1991. Macedonia became the first country to secede from Yugoslavia without bloodshed. Its leaders and people sought recognition from the West, and a large Macedonian diaspora community here in the United States supported that independence movement. But the influential Greek lobby and their friends in the European community prevented this. The first country to recognize Macedonia was the then Russian satellite Bulgaria, followed second by Turkey. However, the first international power to recognize Macedonia was Russia in August 92, not even a year after Macedonia declared independence. Now let us compare that with the United States, who recognized Macedonia in 94, and the European Union, who once stated that Macedonia should not be allowed in the new name of this country, and then later backtracked, recognized Macedonia in 95. The Macedonian people, if Macedonian people who had just gained their independence sought alliances with the West, why did the West wait so long? The reasons are well known, and we could discuss that in later questions. But also, I think there's a need for a panel, given Dan and his insights and knowledge of the situation at the time. And I do want to plug in a recent report that Dan published through the Council on Foreign Relations, talking about a lot of the need for greater U.S. and EU enlargement. A few years back, I remember leading a delegation to the United Nations from and meeting with various missions to the UN, and upon meeting with the now late Russian ambassador Churkin, which, by the way, was the envoy from Russia that submitted the recognition in '92 to Skopje, his comments were, "Why are you here? We recognize you as Macedonia. You need to work on the rest, including France." And just for all of your info, 137 countries recognize Macedonia today, including 4 out of the 5 Permanent Security Council members, except France, who was the only country to really stand by Greece during the veto of Macedonia's membership in NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008. So now, Macedonia and Russia, during the first 15 years, both countries signed 40 bilateral agreements, particularly in the economic sphere. This was largely under the Social Democrats, and then later on, Vamaro Depomene, so the Social Democrats are the liberals, and then the Vamaro Depomene are known as the conservatives in Macedonia. Macedonia's first president received one of the highest honors from the state of Russia in the 90s, and then President Ivanov, current president, received honorary recognitions from various Moscow universities during his most recent visits to Russia. A few things on the economic relations. Macedonia's largest pharmaceutical company, Alkaloid, has a Russian subsidiary, a lot of Russian investments in this company. There's a lot of investments in the agricultural industry. Lukoil, which is prominently displayed throughout the country. There are no other, largely most of the Macedonian-owned oil companies, gas stations sold off, and so Lukoil is now the most prominent investor in that. The energy market, which really largely wasn't dependent on Russia, Macedonia started bringing in, and under then Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski signed up to South Stream in 2013 to diversify apparently this energy market. And there's a report that I want to bring to your attention. By the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, obtained documents that stated that Kremlin's aim is to control strategic energy resources through partnership with the Balkan countries and to make Macedonia exclusively dependent. And another thing this report said is that they had obtained documents that reported that the Kremlin's goal in Macedonia was to dissuade joining of NATO. And so I have to say that post-2008, that's really when we saw Russian involvement, greater Russian involvement in Macedonia, not really prior to that, although those agreements were signed, although there were many visits, heads of state and whatnot, but it wasn't until Macedonia was blocked from membership into NATO. And so I want to state a few facts here. Sergei Lavrov.
You need to wrap up.
Yes. And so Sergei Lavrov has made numerous statements over the last 5 years on Macedonia, more statements than I've ever seen on Macedonia coming from Russia. They upped their embassy staff. I believe they doubled their embassy staff around 2015, which had largely, as I said, not been existent there. The U.S., something and why Russia has been able to fill a lot of void is, keep in mind, every time Macedonia has been asked for support from the United States, Macedonia has delivered, whether that's Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, and whatnot. And you haven't seen that kind of support reciprocated in terms of, let's say, high-level visits, because we in the Balkans love when we get visits from leaders from the West, and then obviously we use that in our media to win points. And so there hasn't been a president of the United States visit Macedonia since 1999, a Secretary of State since 2001, and a defense secretary since 2007. And so a country that's on the verge of joining NATO or wants to join NATO, and the US and NATO partners are saying Macedonia deserves to be, you can see where a lot of people are starting to believe that, well, no, the US or the EU or NATO are not our friends, but really Russia is. And so there's a lot more details that I want to go into, particularly the establishment of a Russian Orthodox Church recently, a lot more investments in the economic sector, but perhaps we could do that during the question and answer session.
Thank you, Meto. Mr. Minister Byrovich.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the other participants for their great insights. which have allowed me to actually shorten my presentation. I'll try to be more brief than the rest of them. So my first message is that now, and considering that there's so much talk about Russia and Russian involvement everywhere around the world, and including the Balkans, it is no longer true that decision makers in the West, especially here in Washington, underestimate Russia. I have for years been trying to get people in Washington to pay attention to what the Russians were doing, and the usual answer that one would get from people making decisions in Washington was that Russia was more or less a middling power whose, time is basically expiring. I think today that very few people would dare make such a stupid statement, if you ask me. Because we've seen in the Balkans in the last several years that power is not measured by how big your GDP is. Power is measured how able you are as a country, as a great power, which Russia has obviously shown that it still is, how capable you are of getting outcomes. And Russians, in my view, have been far better at getting the outcomes that they want, especially in the, I'm going to focus on Bosnia, obviously, in my remaining 8.5 minutes. They've been much better at getting the outcomes they want than the West was, especially the US. We've heard about the sort of usual things that we think about when people talk about Russia and the Balkans. They talk about energy issues and their ability to essentially capture the most of the energy capacities around the region. Dependence they want to create with the countries in terms of natural gas, especially. We've heard that they have the complete control over the Serbian state security, which is more or less, I think, something that a lot of people will now concede. But one angle that is rarely talked about is that there was a strategic and tactical alliance between what the Russians did between 2005 and 2014 in most of the region and the European countries. I think that the German government saw that there was a need for temporary tactical alliance with the Russians when it came to European integration processes. Because if you remember, when the Merkel government came in 2005, when she won the election, one of the first things they did, they essentially sent everybody a message that the the integration into European Union, especially after 2007, when Romania and Bulgaria entered, needed to just kind of, slow down, which is what the Russians wanted, because Russia's strategic goal in the Balkans is no NATO, and if possible, some sort of a conflagration that would essentially make the countries unable to join NATO more or less forever. If you don't have clear borders, you can't join NATO. It is, in my view, the reason they did what they did in Ukraine, they did what they did in Georgia, and that's what they're trying to do in the Balkans right now, especially in Bosnia, in my view. But until the downing of MH17 and the Ukrainian crisis, the Germans were not so on board. I mean, I'm being very frank with you. This is something that's now become very apparent. Besides the lack of awareness, and I think the inability to accept that a country with such a weaker economy than the countries that Western diplomats represent is able to so effectively utilize power and wield power on the ground, there was, of course, the marriage of convenience between some of the Europeans and the Russians because of the the need to slow down the European integration processes. And a lot of this was apparent in many ways when I was at a time mostly in Bosnia. When you look at, for example, the weekly meetings of the countries that make up the so-called SBA or the PIC meeting. So every week, ambassadors who make up the PIC sit down in the main countries and they basically talk it out. As part of OHR, the Office of High Rep. And it would very often happen that Russians would be against, and then so Germans could abstain on a lot of these issues, from security to referendums in the RS to a lot of other things that were sort of on the agenda during that time. It was Russia's role was to kind of act as a way for the Europeans, especially Germans and the Spanish and sometimes even French, to kind of say, maybe they're right. Let's just take it easy. Let's not get ourselves involved too much in the local electoral processes. And Germans would, of course, vehemently deny what I'm saying, but if you look at the actual minutes of the meetings, it's all there. The other problem was that there was this and this is not something that's Balkan related, there was a dogma that the history had ended. Because people very often say, European officials especially say, but what is the alternative? They're not offering a alternative vision. There's no alternative to European integration. You know, where are you going to go if you don't go to Europe? So we don't need to do much because sooner or later the decision makers will realize that they cannot get anything out of, or that their peoples cannot get anything out of aligning with Russia, which was also, I think today we know, completely delusional, because there is a model that Putin has very successfully created, and he has very successfully exported it around the world. I think that, I think it was the gentleman from Montenegro who mentioned sharp power. I mean, we're seeing now finally the awareness that needed to be there from the get-go, that there is an alternative model, and it's very attractive if you're running a corrupt government in the Balkans. It's as simple as that. As a matter of fact, it is my view that their model is far more likely to succeed in countries that are similar to the Balkan countries and some of the Eastern European countries, because what we're seeing in Poland, what we're seeing in Hungary, what we're actually seeing in Austria in a way, is, in my view, much more similar to what Russia is than what you see in the West in liberal democracies. So as a result of this, you know, several sort of things coming together, 12 years, last 12 years in Bosnia were basically lost. So country hasn't moved anywhere in the last 12 years. It coincided with the victory of later on pro-Russian party in the RS part of Bosnia, which very successfully, we must admit that they were very successful at what they did. They, you know, knew what they wanted, they got what they wanted. And they had the power that supported them in getting there. So NATO is a no-go. They've basically stymied that probably for good. European integration process has essentially turned it on its head. It is no longer used to build up state capacities. It is now a way to actually disintegrate Bosnia as a state, which the EU went along with at the insistence of powers that be in Brussels, including the so-called coordination mechanism, which gives cantons and entities veto power over all things related to European Union, which is the reason that Bosnia is the last of all the countries that European officials talked about today in terms of, you know, the prospects for European integration. It is partially their responsibility as well. And, you know, the media angle is very important, and I agree with what you're saying, but I never bought into the narrative of that, you know, that disinformation essentially is the main reason for the reality we live in. I don't think that's the reason. I think that it is far more complex. There's far more to how they exercise their power, and I think in the long term, it is far more based on hard power capabilities, and that's my last point, Dan. What they're doing right now, besides the stuff that we know, you know, in energy and you know, relations with Serbia, they're building up paramilitary capacities in Bosnia very seriously, very methodically, and it is something that will most likely create a big headache for everybody everywhere, but especially a big headache for people who live in the country. It is undisputed. They're building new facilities in close to Banja Luka airport, which they've signed. The Moscow Regional Ministry of Interior has signed an agreement with the RS Ministry of Interior to have Russian trainers come into Bosnia in the next few months. So there will be a Russian semi-base next to Banja Luka, next to the airport. And very importantly, their relationship, because it's not so simple, their relationship, and I'm glad that Mr. Rukavina has considered what I'm about to say, their relationship with the Croatian government and the Croat parties in Bosnia is extremely close as it is to their proxy in Banja Luka. So Croatia and Russia disagree on most things except for when it comes to Bosnia. Russian ambassador is the only one who supports the completely, absolutely ludicrous request of the HDZ in Bosnia to have legal supremacy over the rest of the citizenry. Russians are completely in support of that, together with the Croats from Croatia. And their point is that unless the HDZ is appeased, we will have instability, which I think the recipe for is absolutely there. So unless there's, you know, something is done from the side of Washington, I think we're going to have a very, very negative next few months and unfortunately probably years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, that's an extraordinary panel, an extraordinary range of discussion. Let me open it to questions and comments. I don't rule out comments,
Right.
but I want them short.
Daniel, can I just respond to one
Sure,
swipe
Steve,
that
go
Rove
ahead.
took? And
Go
first of
ahead.
all-
I heard that swipe.
That was not a swipe.
No.
It was a
And I agree. And there was a lot of Serbian police being trained in 2014 and 2017, Sarici camp. The Cossacks and the Russian FSB have been in there quite seriously for 3 or 4 years, and I think that is a real concern. But for you to say that the Croatians have a cozy or close relationship with the Russians is just not true. It's not predicated on any facts. And the Russian ambassador can stand up like they do in whatever country with their Kremlin playbook and say, we support Croatia's third entity. But that's the Russian ambassador trying to create divisions, I think, with the Croatians and all. So I don't think there's any evidence.
But they support the goals. You agree with that?
The Russian
Because it's a
ambassador
fact.
doesn't, the Serbs,
Well,
yes.
true.
But that doesn't mean Dodik is meeting with the Russian ambassador to create a tactical step-by-step plan and such. So anyway, just to clarify that a little bit.
All right,
But
all
I
right.
wanted to reemphasize your point, too, about the danger of the Russians being in Republic of Srpska training their police through the Ministry of the Interior. It's
think
it's a
we've
concern. It
restored-
should be for the region.
We've restored peace and tranquility between Croatia and Bosnia. May I proceed?
Yes, yes, we're fine.
Obrad. We have a microphone. For those who are standing in the back, I've got some empty seats up front. You're welcome to them.
Thank you, Dan. First, a small statement of fact. And I would call on my colleague who's here from the Ministry of Interior of the Republika Srpska, Tatjana Telić, who's in charge of international programs, and who has overseen most of the training programs done with the United States security forces, CIA, FBI, as well as other government agencies over the last, what, Tatjana, 10 years? Yeah, and most of that training has been done in country, in the Republika Srpska, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, through joint training programs. And most of it was centered around joint training exercises. So all of it has been transparent. Nothing has been hidden because it's impossible in Bosnia-Herzegovina to hide anything, given that there was first a UN peacekeeping force, also oversight over the police by the international community, and also, on top of that now, a European peacekeeping force. So if the Russians are creating paramilitary forces, it would be very interesting to see who in Europe is working with them and ignoring their mandates within Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I apologize to everybody. I'm Obrad Kesic, the head of the Republika Srpska office here in Washington,
We all know
DC.
you. We all know you.
No, not everybody does. But just a question for all of you. Because it seems that you have one thing in common. You, other than Meto, who I think was a little bit distant from the passion that expressed. You all seem to be obsessed with the Russian influence in the Balkans. But the facts on the ground indicate that there has been overwhelming dominance of the EU presence and the US presence on the ground in the Balkans. So what has happened to all of the influence since the wars in the tragic wars in the 1990s that has changed things, where the US and the EU and all the countries in the Balkans are committed to an EU path? Why is it that all of that has been put in jeopardy by what seems to be a very little bit of amount of money, some media presence, and a lot of speculation that we heard today about clandestine activities?
Can I?
I
take this
think
one?
I think Obrad asks a good question.
Can I just
And,
respond very
Rayo
quickly?
first, then
of course.
Jelena.
Well, I mean, Obrad, you're right that the EU has not done what it should have done. I completely agree. However, they did point out in their 2016 a Parliament document exactly what I just said. So what I just said is a quote from a EU document, that there is an agreement that you don't deny, and I'm sure the nice official here would not deny, that the Minister of RS Interior, Lukacs, has signed an agreement with a Russian police official in Moscow. It's absolutely undeniable. It's online. You can see photos. If you want, I'll give you, I can give you, I have it in my phone. It's nezavisne.com. It's on your website, Ministry of Interior website. It is, what I'm saying is absolutely people deny that, apples are apples. They say they're bananas. I mean, it's fine. We're used to it by now. White is black, black is white. But there's absolutely no doubt that the Europeans know, that the Americans know and that it's happening. It's absolutely undeniable. So whether it's a lot or whether it's something that you think is normal, I don't think it's normal. I think it's stepping outside of the boundaries of the Dayton Peace Accords, whereby security of such kind is something that the state level should do. And what I said here was not everything that was said recently in public. It was completely supported by the state minister, Mektic, word by word, and including that the several of the members of the paramilitary organizations were PNG'd, so can no longer enter Bosnia. So I agree that this is a serious situation, that it should be addressed, and probably the best move by RS police would be to call off everything. I think the best move for you would be to, we no longer want to cooperate, and please don't send Spetsnaz trainers to Banja Luka. I mean, I think that would be a statement of intent.
Madam Tatiana, maybe I can give you a response. Then you,
I mean, just
stand up and
shortly,
introduce yourself again. You're new to all of us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. My name is Tatiana Telic. I'm the representative of the Republic of Srpska government, Ministry of the Interior of the Republic of Srpska, in charge for international cooperation of behalf of the Ministry of Interior for almost 18 years now. I'm very, disappointed to hear that in a place such this one is, we have, we can all hear stories that are completely not true. There is a memo of understanding that was signed with the Moscow police, which is, in preamble of that memo, there is a cooperation agreement of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Russian Federation. So you were the minister in the Council of Ministers of Bosnia and Herzegovina, so you should know that there is an agreement between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Russian Federation. That was a legal bound that we mentioned in that memo of understanding. Memo of understanding is a paper that we would sign with any other police organization in the world. So it is just a kind of possibility to establish cooperation with another police partner. Having that with Moscow police that has more than 100,000 police officers was just a benefit in a sense of possible, exchange of experience. There were no Russian visits at all in sense of special forces to Banja Luka and to the Ministry of Interior of the Republic of Srpska, although I think I should know, justify this at all at this place. And there were no training with Russian special police forces of the Republic of Srpska police forces at all. We are doing that on daily basis with the United States Special Forces. They are in my office every day. As Obrad stated, I daily cooperate with FBI, with CIA, with US Armed Forces. Every week we have a training with US Armed Forces, sometimes just for the Ministry of Interior of the Republic of Srpska, very often jointly with SIPA and the Special Force of the Federation. So it's completely not true. I don't know what
first of all, I was never in the Council of Ministers. For your information, I was never in the Council of Ministers. So let me correct your statement. And second of all, you confirmed everything that I said. There is a memorandum of understanding. There is stuff on your website. On your website, stuff. What I just said is on your website. It is very easily verifiable. Did you go to Moscow?
Yeah.
You went to Moscow. So was there follow-up visits, because your website says that the cooperation on anti-terrorism activities is ongoing?
You were saying about training of the special forces, and I'm answering to that. You also mentioned kind of, I don't know the wording that you used, base near the Banja Luka airport. I assume you are thinking about the Ministry of Interior training center.
Mahovljani.
Mahovljani's airport. In Zaluzhani, there is
Or
a police
Zaluzhani,
training
yes.
center. Yes.
So there is the training center.
Rail,
Is it about
rail,
to be
rail,
completed? Okay,
rail.
sorry.
And the Russians has nothing to do with that.
Daniel,
They've
just
never been there visiting that center.
Well, that's not,
Okay.
that's not what
Thank
the
you.
website says.
Thank you. Yelena.
I have to say that I object the assessment that panelists here are obsessed with Russia. I think that we have to understand what starts first and then what caused the response and reaction. Before I intensified undemocratic and now openly hostile Russian influence in the region. For example, the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies has been much more dealing with the uncompleted security sector reform and in general with the Serbian EU integration and with the Euro-Atlantic policies in the region than we have been dealing with Russians. So, you know, there is this joke about the teenager and psychiatrist and obsession with female breasts, you know. So let's see who has started first, actually. I think it is Russian obsession to impede not only Western Balkans NATO integration, but its democratization and actually stabilization and EU integration. This is where I actually disagree with Mr. Bajrović. The Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies a few years ago published a report about increased Russian soft power in the region, in particular in Serbia, with more than 1,000 references. The Russian structures have never managed, Sputnik included, to debunk one single reference here. They tried, believe me. What they did instead, they became actually obsessed with a pretty small think tank at the moment, Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies. They took down our websites. They sent heavy hitters from IN4S in Montenegro. After me, I went through one of the biggest, and this is what I rarely do, but now because you said obsessed, I'm going to, reply to you. I went personally and as a director of organization through one of the biggest vilify and amplify campaigns that have ever been held against any NGO leader in the region. And believe me, there are some of us who have been talking about war crimes and some other issues and who have some kind of experience with being, harassed by Serbian or regional, uncontrolled security services, nationalists, etc., etc. I've never experienced anything like that, to an extent that my own government, under Prime Minister Vučić, and Mr. Vučić and I are not always in the best of terms, provided me police protection. This is how I was obsessed with Russians. I would say that they were obsessed with me. And further down the road, speaking about the issue that has been addressed here, the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies is currently, following the adoption of new legislation in the security and in defense structures. And there is a piece of legislation related to emergency planning and crisis management, which is one of, surprise, surprise, subjects of the Serbia-NATO Individual Partnership Action Plan. And this is exactly the piece of legislation that Russia is suffocating and slowing it down because of the existence of so-called Russia-Serbia Humanitarian Center in Niš. And I think it would be very bad for people who still want EU integration of Bosnia and Herzegovina, at least paying lip service to it, to understand that this position and situation with regard to Serbia-Russia Humanitarian Center does not have that much to do with Serbia-US or Russia-US relationship. It has all to do with the fact that Serbia has become 35th member of the EU mechanism for civilian protection, and I suppose Bosnia would like to do the same if it wants to continue with the EU integration, and that actually the EU Commissioner for Emergency Situations said that the existence, dubious position, and increased number of claims coming from Russian side to get the diplomatic status for something which is allegedly humanitarian center with experience in training firefighters is slightly unusual, to put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Daniel, I just have to make one comment.
Yes.
Oberad and the minister from the Ministry of Interior had 6 minutes. I visited Bishop Komarza, the Nobel Peace Prize nominee, in May 2017, and he gave me a 14-page document that detailed maybe they're ex-FSB and Russian Cossacks and all that coming into Republika Srpska. It was not for paramilitary groups, and it was not for joint activities. So you muddy the water and you act like there's nothing going on behind the scenes, training Russians training Serb police and RS, And I don't believe what you were just saying, and it's not true. And I have evidence and documents that show there is a direct training relationship between Russia and the Republic of Srpska.
Please, please.
Show me the report.
Clara Bilgin, Virginia International University. I actually think that the jumping in of the two officials from Republika Srpska show that sharp power can also be exercised through proxy, even here in Washington, D.C. at size. And it actually works. It muddies the waters. It basically confirms facts that are not true, and everybody working on the Balkans know that you are not correct and that the facts are different as they were presented here. So yes, let us all see how sharp power through these by proxy officials can be exercised. My question is different. Both of you spoke very forcefully about militarization of the Balkans through Russian interference. And I think this is going to bite the Balkans very badly very soon. So how much time do you give the Balkans to see an inflammation of ethnic conflict coming up either in Serbia or Bosnia and Herzegovina or possibly in Kosovo? I think we are going as a very fast and express train to an ethnic conflict, possibly in one of those countries, possibly in the Balkans as a whole. And we all have to focus on this impending danger, including our own administration here in Washington, D.C. and in the U.S.
Seems to me that maybe Sinisha, I see, wants to take that on. Maybe Meto as well.
Just a small comment, never confuse obsession with passion, that's one. And the second thing, the theme of the day is Russia. If we talked about India, we would be equally passionate about India. So I would say that it's self-evident that obsession and passion don't go hand in hand. One thing about the potential for conflict, this is my field of expertise, is that for a conflict to arise, an armed conflict to arise, you need opportunities, but also organizational capabilities. I don't see the same neither opportunities nor organizational capabilities as we have seen them in the 1990s, especially when it comes to the availability of weapons, when it comes to the polarization of the blocks in the same way. Now everything is more ambivalent. Now everything is a little bit, to use the same recycled word, diluted. We do not know what the real intentions are. There is always a spin to a different direction, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to an armed conflict, I would not raise the bar, or decrease actually at this point, the bar so easily. However, one thing when it comes to the militarization of the Balkans, I would not say that it's militarizing in an actual physical sense, but the rhetoric is militarizing. And we are observing that on a daily basis. We're observing a very belligerent, confrontational, antagonistic rhetoric in the Balkans. We're seeing it especially between major capitals, so Zagreb and Belgrade. We're seeing it between Belgrade and Pristina. We're seeing it in an intra-Bosnian dynamics. We are seeing it also between Belgrade and Skopje, taking away your entire embassy staff for consultations in conventional diplomatic practice is an act of war. It precedes the act of war. And that didn't happen, fortunately, but it's these symbolic gestures that we are seeing. And the militarization of the rhetoric is what adds to the chaos in the hearts and minds of the people. So if I can just accentuate this. When it comes to the Russian involvement in the Balkans, I would still maintain this sharp power angle. Russia is successfully addressing a long-term goal, and that is maintaining some form of orientation of the Balkans towards Moscow. I'm not talking about chaos, I'm not talking about destabilization, but it's still oriented towards Moscow. And what they are playing is a long-term game. The EU, the West, is playing a short-term game with the Balkans by posing arbitrary, artificial, self-imposed deadlines and thresholds that need to be passed, which creates a fatigue among the populations of the Balkans about the accession and losing hopes about the potential accession in the Balkans. And we're saying if you have an alternative that is a long shot, why not consider it? And this is where I see this dynamic of militarized rhetoric, belligerent rhetoric, kind of digress from the actual policy preferences that all governments in the Balkans now have.
Meto.
Thank you. Just going back to Obrad, I think we all have to somewhat, everybody in Washington has to share blame because the Obama administration was very complacent on the Balkans. We went from administrations that were very active in the Balkans to an administration that didn't see the Balkans as a priority, and now with this administration, even less. And so that's one area one thing I wanted to mention. Another thing is I would have loved to have somebody talk about the Russian influence in Greece, which is also a part of the Balkans, because Macedonia has been in the news for 4 years now, since the wiretapping scandal, and now about the name issue. Just some facts. Milosevic, who was obviously Russia's proxy in the region, had a plan with the father of now the current opposition leader in Greece, Konstantin Mitsotakis, had a plan to divide Macedonia. You've heard repeated statements in Greece from public officials, Foreign Minister of Greece, Samaras, later on Cultural Minister, and then later on Prime Minister, that why are we focusing on the name issue when Macedonia is going to be divided between Greater Albania and Greater Bulgaria? The same comment came from Congressman Dana Rohrabacher in an interview with an Albanian television station here last year, that later he withdrew and said, oh, I didn't know the history of the region, and yet we all know Congressman Rohrabacher's connections with Russia. Recently, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, made comments 2 weeks ago that Greece should not make any concessions on the Macedonian name, and that Macedonia should be the ones making the concessions, yet about a year ago, 2 years ago, he was saying that the U.S. is meddling in Macedonia, trying to install different governments and all that. And I'm not here to promote one position over the other. But when you hear these kind of comments, and yet Macedonia made all the concessions possible, change of constitution and all that, and knowing Tsipras, one of his first moves was to have a meeting with the Russian ambassador instead of the U.S. And then Nikos Koutsias, the foreign minister's first foreign visit was to Moscow, not to Washington, D.C. So let's not forget the Russian role that they play in Greece and others on this name dispute. And I know that probably questions will arise, but I want to definitely mention it right now here that there's a lot of meddling on the side of Russia and the United States. I mean, the EU should have and could have probably got Macedonia into NATO and EU during those critical years that they needed to. Instead, they allowed a vacuum to be filled by Russia. And so fake news, where before Obrad kind of alluded to that, and Macedonia being apparently the founder of fake news during the election period, which I really don't believe that we had an impact on the elections here. But yes, there are fake news outlets there in this media and information that's spreading, hostile propaganda against anybody that is pushing Macedonia to be into NATO and EU. But if these institutions want Macedonia in, or all the countries in the region minus Croatia, the promises that were made today in that enlargement strategy and similar promises that were made in 2003 during the Thessaloniki summit need to be reality, not just promises.
Normally, I would say we have enough material to go on for a little while extra, but I can't today because there's another meeting in this room. I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking the panel, but also join me in leaving the room as quickly as possible to another group. But I think it's been an extraordinarily good discussion. I'm proud of the fact that we can have sharp discussion at SAIS. That's what universities are for, and I'm pleased with it. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
This is for your university.
No, I love you.
I got to check with the guy.